Hi, I'm Teresa Shecker, and this week we were asked to discuss, is it relevant still to discuss Western civilization? And I do believe it is. And one of our readings this week was called What is Western Civilization? Written by Lawrence Birkin. He said that it's a vague definition and arguments are over the delineations of cultural boundaries are rather vague. And that's true. Historians argue where the delineation should lie, what the actual definition should be. And honestly, the question is more of a philosophical concept than it really is a historical question. When we start talking about where, what this really should be, what the question honestly should define, it's more of a philosophical concept than a historical question, if you really think about the idea. But when we get into some of our other readings this week, such as Reflections on Ancient and Modern Freedom, when that article started to define freedom, they did so in two different concepts. So they did that from the different stances of modern freedom and ancient freedom. So modern freedom really was from the more Western tradition that we have now, and ancient freedom was more from the classical Greek interpretation, such as by Socrates. And so when we really start to look at the question, is it still relevant today? I think that you really have to take into account how you look at it. And so if you don't really look at the question as a whole and take into account going all the way back to ancient times, you really can't answer the question. And so this article referenced Isaiah Birkin and the idea of negative freedom, which is freedom from external constraints, which is, something like the Bill of Rights. And then the way that the ancient Greeks thought deeper than negative freedom, and the way that they thought about the greater good, which is really interesting because the concept of greater good is something like the universal good. They thought of that as a good thing. Whereas the more Western idea of greater good is something that we don't necessarily think of as as a good thing. We kind of tend to think of that as more of like a tyranny thing, which you can see of in America when new concepts come out, like the new bills that are trying to be passed, when they're talking about like having control of our bank accounts with, if we have a $600 deposit, and they say, oh, well, that would give us more control. And we're like, but why do you need to know that? We kind of tend to see things where there's more laws, there's less freedom. That's a modern idea of freedom. Whereas in the ancient laws, ancient ideas were where you have less self-mastery of yourself, that was less freedom. And I think it's necessary to look at those things when you're teaching Western civilization to really understand more of those concepts. And so I do think that it's necessary to teach Western civilization still to really get a good concept of what you're teaching and what students should understand. And another thing that was said in that same article was freedom without virtue is self-negating. And honestly, I think it goes without saying at Liberty University or as a Christian historian, freedom without God is self-negating. So in this verse, in Galatians 5:13 and 14, it says, "For you were called to freedom, brethren. Only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And as our video this week pointed out, freedom is literally a translation of the word neighbor. So I thought that this verse fit everything that we've kind of encompassed learning this week extremely well. Another thing that we learned this week was through the video, not through the video, but through the article entitled, Who Put the West in Western Civilization? And I think that this also encompassed with our book, which is entitled Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World by Daniel Hannan, to me is one of the main reasons why the idea of teaching Western civilization, why it's relevant today, is one of the most important reasons. And that is, in our book, it talked about how the argument's made that it's just about a bunch of dead white men. And in the article, Who Put the West in Western Civilization, it talks about how Feminist and black writers and leftists talk about the overshadowing of achievements, and then the leftists talk about how Plato and Aristotle were from a privileged class and they were missing their links towards universal human nature and ethics. And then how it's made, the argument is made that Aristotle made the comment that some were slaves by nature. And that was just a complete misunderstanding of what he meant. What he actually meant was that some are slaves by nature because of our natural human propensity to do things that make no sense. We tend to do things by human nature that can make us slaves to stupid things. If I go out and I go and gamble and I become addicted to that, then I have become a slave to that gambling institution. So I've become a slave to that thing. So, we see right now all of these movements by different organizations to try and say that things are sexist or classist or racist, and not that things can't be that, but if you have such a dumbing down of history and of society to whitewash things or take things away, what are you doing with history? So, yeah, I do think that we need to continue to teach Western civilization. We need to continue to teach history, because when you get rid of these things, how do you remember your history? How do you remember anything that was taught or that is important? And so, Greeks actually denounced racism and sexism and classism. And if we're not teaching that, how do you get back to the basic principles that were being taught? And so I do think that it is ridiculously important to teach those things. And so in another article that we read that was entitled "What Exactly is the West?" that article argues that Western civilization argues for the universal concept of dignity of the human person, which is true. And then it talks about Heraclitus, who coined the term logos, which means inspiration, word, fire, thought, imagination, and then ties that back to how John calls Jesus logos, and Paul calls him the source of all being. And honestly, if we can tie anything back to scripture and to the word, obviously that needs to be the source of all of our inspiration anyway. So that is all I have to say on this subject. Thank you guys. I look forward to this class. I look forward to meeting and working with all of you. Thank you for your time.